Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, welcome to Automation Hour. We are so glad you are here today joining us. A few logistics to get us started. All lines are muted. If you have questions, you can post them in our Automation Hour Trailblazer community group or also in the questions widget here within GoToMeeting. We will be recording this session and it will be posted afterward. We do invite you, as always, to join our Trailblazer community group, the Salesforce Automation Hour, or check out our website for upcoming and past presentations. We are also now on social media, Twitter, so feel free to follow us at Automation Hour. So we've got a few more sessions to cap off the year. Next week, we've got Jay Stedman from Salesforce, former MVP, I believe, and Golden Hoodie winner. Then in December, we have both MVP Hall of Famers Nana Gregg and Marshall King, as well as MVP Ohad Idan, who will be presenting. So we definitely encourage you to register for those great sessions coming up as well. As always, we'd like to say thank you to our sponsors. First is ActiveCampaign, without whom we could not bring this to you. And of course, Concrete.io, who has been with us since the beginning and is how we can continue to offer these webinars to you at no cost. So about 5 years ago or so, we founded Automation Hour, and the co-founders were David, Jen, and Rakesh. We've gone through some changes over the years, and so the current co-hosts are Rakesh Gupta and Michelle Hansen, which is me. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Michael Barnes. He is the director of Salesforce.com for NBC Sports Next. He has a very extensive resume of presentations. He's also multiple certified and, of course, a Trailhead Ranger, so we are thrilled to invite him here. So with that, Mike, we'll pass it over to you. All right. Sorry, Mike, I'm working on figuring out how to change the presenter here. All right. Are you there, Mike? All right, I don't think we're able to hear you. There we go. I think you're back.
Sorry about that. I had to turn it off and turn it back on. It was giving me one of those technology challenges there for a second. I'm Michael Barnes. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can know. Can you see my screen already? Let's see. I got to check to see which screen I'm sharing.
We have your PowerPoint screen showing right now.
See that? Okay, let me change that. Show screen. It'll be easier if I share this other one. Just monitor 2. Okay, so fantastic. So I'll start with just a little bit background about myself. I'm Michael Barnes, Director of Salesforce.com Administration at NBC Sports Next. NBC Sports Next is a relatively new group, part of NBC Universal. Ultimately, Comcast is our large parent company. We were founded as part of the Golf Channel and have expanded since then as a spinoff of the Golf Channel. The Golf Channel is, of course, still part of NBC Sports, but the NBC Sports Next group is all the technology businesses around that NBC Sports has underneath. That includes Sports Engine, which is youth sports registrations, Golf Now, and the other golf businesses, of which I am directly a part, and also our sports betting and future technology businesses. So we have quite a bit going on the NBC Sports Next group, and it's an exciting place to be. So a few things that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about our record-triggered flows. That's the main thing I wanted to talk about and share with you how I use them currently and what they're useful for. One of the things that if you did not see at Dreamforce, but if you did, it's that record-triggered flows are the future of automating in Salesforce. So at least on the back end, making things happen. We've had historically workflow rules were around forever, and then we had Process Builder was introduced and Flow was introduced. Flow was initially a screen-based, wizard type application was the intent behind it. And then they started doing what they called headless flows, where you could call a flow like through a button. And then later on, Process Builder, you could actually call a flow from Process Builder. And so an action, saving a record or making an update to a record could kick off a flow, which was really exciting when we could do that. So there's been a little bit of an evolution, but now Flow can be called directly on its own, which is really exciting. With in the last couple of releases, they released record triggered flows, and in the most recent release of Salesforce, we can do pretty much everything we need to do. That we no longer really need workflow rules or process builder. In fact, what I understand, and this is based on what I heard at Dreamforce, so take that with that much grain of salt, is that the workflow rules and process builder may not be around for forever. So if you haven't got into record triggered flows, this is probably the time to start looking into them. One of the really great features is that you can do before and after triggered flows. So before can be a little bit faster because it's going to run before your database has been updated, and of course everything has before the commit. But the after trigger is what you're probably used to with the workflow rule or most process builders happening after you've tried click save, and then before it's actually after it's actually already staged and ready to commit, and then it runs all these, runs through all your workflows and actions and things like that. So after triggers, you have a little, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't know if we might have a little technical snafu. Right now we're seeing in NBC Universal, you can't access this right now screen. Is that what you intended to show?
No, I'm so sorry. Let me stop sharing. I'm going to get off of the, that's really weird. Reason, error. Okay, am I back on?
We're still seeing your desktop with your global protect disabled now, is the screen that we're seeing.
Well, that's really bizarre. I thought that would help. Goodness gracious. So, okay, let me see what this is. You can access your sign-in successful, not meet the criteria. Weird. I'm sorry about that. Are you still seeing that?
We're still seeing that desktop screen, so I don't know if you've got something else
Okay,
showing.
let me pull my, you just see a blank, do you see just a blank desktop?
Yep.
Now do you see my flow?
I cannot. I'm still seeing your desktop.
That is so weird.
Okay, there we go. Flow Builder is now up and running.
Okay, it was just showing the wrong screen. Let me, okay, well, I will stay on this screen over here then, since that one's working. I apologize, everybody. So thank you for your patience for technical challenges here today. So let me get back to my slides, because that was how I was trying to just give you the rundown here. So the before and after triggers are two different ways, and I'll show you this once I get into the demonstration portion next. There's also an on delete option, so which is, so you have, of course, you had on create or modify a record. Now you can actually separate and only run on create, only run on update, or only run on create or update, or you can run on delete. And delete is always before trigger, and it's because obviously once your record's deleted, then you have no information available to to query information on that record that's being deleted. So one of the limitations though on delete is you can't prevent the record from being deleted. Unless, again, you have, there's not really a way to do that. So there are ways to do that with Apex. However, you can cause it to run and do other updates to other records. So that's one thing that's been super handy for me, and I'll show you an example of that in my org. And then also I'll share with you some flow best practices, and that'll help you avoid flow failures. That's probably the most challenging thing working with flow, is that if you don't set it up to avoid validation rules and other things, you can, or SOQL query limits, you can run into these nasty little flow failures. Now, the good news is Salesforce sends, you can set it up to send yourself or any other admins an email that'll just detail the flow. And actually now in the emails, there's a link that'll take you right to the flow. It'll actually show you where in the flow it failed. It's really, really helpful troubleshooting tools. But hey, we want to avoid getting there to begin with. So I'll share with you how to keep from having to troubleshoot and fix errors by building your flow out properly the first time. All right, so this is an example of a flow that I have. Actually, let me go back to this one. I was just. So this is I've got a few examples of flows that I'm going to share here today, and this is these are all going to be record triggered flows. So you can create flows that are not triggered by a record, that are called by Process Builder, or that have screens in them. I'm not going to talk about those today. Screen flows, of course, won't be able to run as a record triggered flow. So record triggered flow means that some action has happened in the database side of the application, not the UI side. And Salesforce is now going to run an action to make some updates to records in your org based on business rules you've set in your flow. When you have screen-based flows, those usually have to happen in a lightning component, or a button has to call the flow up, and then you will then go, and then your user may have to input information into those flows. But those wouldn't necessarily, they would not be record triggered flows. They would be then screen flows. So this is a record triggered flow, and you'll see that on the input side, we have multiple options here: created, updated, or on delete. In this case, I'm just choosing to only run when a record's updated, and I'm specifically looking for these kind of changes. If in this case, my T-sheet vendor or point of sale vendor has been updated and it's not null, then I'm going to run, and I'm doing my flow as an after trigger. So it's an after event. The fast field updates, that's your before trigger that I mentioned earlier. And the actions related to records, which is the default, that is the after trigger. Another feature that is handy that I'll show you a little later in this presentation as well is the run asynchronous path. So that's a relatively new feature that was added to record triggered flows that you can decide if you want to run these immediately upon the update to the record, or you can wait till the record's actually committed to the database, and then it will run after the fact. And what that can do is save you from perhaps hitting a validation rule and causing a challenge with the actual save. It may not run your flow may still fail, but at least your save will be committed. So that's why sometimes putting a delay is sometimes helpful. It also can help you avoid limits. So using an asynchronous run can keep you from hitting too many query limits. So if you're running a lot of different actions on the particular save, you're looking up a lot of related records, you're doing a lot of mass updating, a lot of related records perhaps, then you could run into SOQL query limits. There's a limit of how many records you can update or query. There's DMLs in a single update, single action, single a group in Salesforce. So if you run into that, it may be a good idea to try to do a delay, which we've employed those a few times in our org to avoid issues. So you can see here that I am using the run immediately path. You can choose from this section run immediately, or you can schedule a path to run at a later time. Let's say this happens, I want like an hour later, I want this email to go out to let somebody know, hey, this has happened. I don't want them to have it go right away for whatever reason. And then if you choose the asynchronous checkbox, that asynchronous choice will show up in the scheduled paths automatically. So you don't have to build that one. Just have to check the box on the front end, and it shows up in your scheduled outputs automatically. So you'll see this is a pretty basic flow. It's in the fact that I'm just doing a quick record type lookup. That's another best practice. Not to hard code IDs where feasible. In this case, I'm trying to get a record type ID, and I'm doing it based on a API name, the developer name of that record type on that object. So, and then I'm doing some decisions based on information in that record. Again, with record triggered flows, what's really nice is you have this $record attribute that's available. So that's, instead of having to pass in an ID to the flow and then having to look up the record to get all the fields on that record and do something with them. With the record triggered flow, you automatically get the record in the as one of the attributes here in in the flow. And excuse me one second. So you'll see that if I click if I start typing $, you'll see I have all these global variables, which you probably do a whole presentation on just all the global variables in here. But the one I'm going to focus on is you have record and you have record prior. So even if you're doing an after trigger flow, you still have access to the prior state of that record that you're doing your updates to. or that kicked off the flow, I should say, because you may not necessarily be updating that record. You could be updating related records, perhaps. Excuse me. So I'm in this case looking for looking at the after state. There's particular field changed, and you click in here and you get access again to all the fields, whether it's created by or whatever it is. I can come in into any of the fields. You can drill in multiple layers, which is super handy in the way Flow is constructed now. So I make my decisions. I'm doing an assignment, and this is where I recommend anytime you're making updates to records in Flow, to always use assignments, whether it's the record that caused the flow to in this case, this flow to run, or if you are updating other related records or looking up, other records another way, and you're going to ultimately do any kind of creates or updates. It's a great idea to use an assignment to set the values on those flows. So that will help you to avoid, again, hitting limits, because you want to do all your updates typically at the end. Do them only once. One of the challenges I've had, in some trial and error that I've done in the past is, make somewhere in my flow, and maybe have a much larger flow than this, I'll make an update to a record, and then later on I'll make some more decisions, and I'll make a secondary update to that same record. I've learned that's a really, really bad idea, because you're trying to make two updates to the same record may cause your flow or other flows in your org to workflows to kick off again at the point in time in the flow that it tries to commit that save, and try and do a secondary save on the same record may fail because there's a save still pending on that same record. So it's always a good idea to make all your updates with assignments, because it could be you're going to make different updates at different times throughout the flow to different fields, and then commit all your changes at the end. Is a great idea. In this case, I'm doing another lookup because I'm getting a specific record, a specific account record, based on some information based on this decision and the information I'm gathering here. And then I'm doing a update based on, again, specific information. So this is just a quick record triggered flow, just looking for account to be updated, meet those criteria, and run right through. One of the things that I'm planning to do, though, and you'll see that I don't have a lot of these right now in my org, simply because it is relatively new. And one of the features that I was missing, and actually I was very happy to see was in the latest release, is being able to call a subflow. So if you tried to do record triggered flow in the past, you may have found that subflow wasn't available. You couldn't do it. So you could not replace Process Builder in a lot of instances where maybe you have some pretty complicated flows downstream. You don't want to rebuild them all in a brand new record triggered flow. So if you want to replace Process Builder, for example, you might want, and that existing Process Builder calls downstream flows, you very well may want to call it using a subflow. Just make your decision. You do your decision elements. Say, hey, based on what changed here, I'm going to go ahead and call this subflow, and that's a great way to compartmentalize your code, as it were, right? So it's clicks, not code, but you can think of like a flow as like a little snippet of code that you're creating that you're creating it declaratively, and if you create a standard flow, not a screen flow, but a standard flow instead, now the record triggered flow can run, do decisions, and then call a again, it has to be a non-screen flow, but it can call those, and I could put all this information, or at least all the stuff past maybe the major decision points, in the subflow, and that way you could. What you can do, and it's again another good best practice, is to control the order of events and things that happen. Right now, it's going to run all my record triggered flows in whatever order Salesforce feels like it. If I have multiple account record triggered flows, instead, as I go forward, I might want to do decisions and say, okay, if a number of changes could happen at the same time, perhaps, and I want to go ahead and run this action. I want to make sure this thing happens first. This update to these accounts happens as a first step. You might want to do that and have that in a downstream flow, and then say only, and then have a second action maybe also run in a separate subflow. That can help you also with just keeping your flows from getting too crazy, because some of these flows can really get big as your business rules expand over time on specific flows. So this is another example of a record triggered flow where, again, I'm doing, mention the same kind of thing, where I'm doing all my assignments here at this level, and then I'm making additional assignments later. So that was the point I was trying to make on that last level. This is a better example of it, where I'm making potentially multiple updates to the same record, but I'm only doing one record update. So again, a good idea. Ultimately, this is updating the record that I started with. So you could, so this is you can always choose use the ID of the record and then just choose the record. By default, it's going to ask you if you want to use the revenue record that triggered the flow, but that's if but you'll then have to set the fields independently at that level. Using I used assignments, I highly recommend using the ID and field values from a record or record collection. And then you can just pop, if it's just the one record, you put it here. If you've added everything to a collection, which I'll show you an example of that here soon, then you can update an entire collection of records in one batch instead of trying to update them one at a time in a loop or something like that, which we don't want to do if we can avoid it. So this is a delete, an example of on delete. So this is where you'll see that I've chosen if a revenue record is deleted for some reason, it's being purged. So because I only let people do that if it's like a staged record we haven't actually started collecting revenue, and they need to pull it out of their system. It could be deleted, and in which case I'm just running it every time. So there's no conditions. If it's deleted, I'm running. But you'll see that I don't have a choice to do after. It's only before the record's deleted. Whenever you choose this choice, that's by its default. So what I'm doing as soon as deleted here, I'm getting all the other revenue records that are associated with the same payment, and I'm doing some calculations around how much that payment is worth, because if there could be multiple revenue. In our case, we do a lot of custom type of payments, so we have custom objects storing information around that, and we are going to calculate the annualized amount based on all the related revenue records, except for the one that we just deleted. So you'll see here that when I pull this up, if it'll let me, that it's going to not include the record that was, the ID is not equal to the record of the one that just caused this to run. So that's one of the criteria. So I make sure I'm getting everything else but this one, because again, this is before it's been deleted, so it's still there, so I can use it to identify the related payment. That's important, so I can find other information and make this update. So whenever a revenue record's added, I have a similar process that runs to calculate the total annualized value of that in that account. But my challenge was, man, what happens if somebody has to delete one for some reason? So now you have this option to do this right inside Flow, which again, before we had the delete triggered flows available, you would have to do that in some kind of Apex. There was not a really good way to run any automation on that. So that's really handy. And there may be some good use cases you'll identify in your own org for when records are deleted. Man, there's something I want to happen. It could just be that, hey, records deleted. I need to email somebody and let them know this was just deleted. That could be a very simple one, right? Just to pass through to an email action and pass some information from that record before it's deleted to somebody and say, hey, somebody's deleting this record, just so you know. And then that way, they need to go into the recycle bin, they can go bring it back. Oh, they shouldn't be deleting that. Wait a second. And maybe put some other controls on your org so they don't delete stuff, and they shouldn't, right? That's something I usually avoid, is having people delete records, but occasionally there are some use cases where it does make sense. So having the before delete is handy. So this is a little more complicated flow, and I wanted to show you this kind of point out one of the things that I do that's not always necessarily a good practice. In fact, you'll see you get these tips, which is really handy. They're trying to keep you out of trouble, that's something I've always appreciated about Salesforce. For all the years I have been using it, is that Salesforce always tries to keep you out of trouble. They try to make it so it's hard to break things. Doesn't mean you can't make a flow that does something that's bad. You definitely can. You can definitely have it update records in a way that you don't want. So it's a good idea, of course, to always do everything in a sandbox. You'll see that I am currently in a sandbox org. So that way anything I do here won't affect my production users. And then test, right? Make sure you're getting the outcomes you expect on everything. And the nice thing is you do have this debug option, which I can always go through if we have some time. Debug is super handy. It's a great way to test your flows, and record trigger flows can be tested as well, which I should show you that, because that's something that I have been using quite often here lately. Because hey, when this record does get updated or does get created, how is that going to affect, or how is it going to run through my flow properly? And do the updates as I expect them to happen. So the one of the things I am doing here that's warning me against is doing database access from within loops. So just what you'll see here is I'm getting revenue allocation records, and then I'm doing looping through those records, and then I'm getting which is really a grandchild record called the capacity record. And I've not found a good workaround for that. If somebody has a suggestion, I'll be open to it. But because there's a payment terms record in between the capacity and the rev allocation, I found that this is the only way I can get what I need. Now, the good news, I know my org, I know the use cases involved for these records, and there's usually not too many that I'm going to actually break Salesforce. This will work. So it's just a warning that you should not really always a good idea to do this. In my case, I know that I'm probably not going to run into any issues, and I haven't so far with this particular one. But a couple things that I do recommend also in any flow as a best practice is to, anytime you do a lookup of records, is to do these decision elements. You'll see that I have a decision, rev allocation found, decision, capacity found, right after my lookup of those records. Because that's possible you return no records. And if you try to do loops or try to do actions on a collection of 0 records, you often get a flow failure. So it's not going to just say, oh, there's nothing here, I'll just keep moving on and not do anything. It's going to, Salesforce flow can get confused on that. So I find the best practice is always put these decision elements after your lookups. Another best practice I find, and I'm still working this out, is whenever you look up any record, in this case, because there can be multiple different payment terms with this, there could be duplicate rev allocations, what I'm getting at, with the same payment. There shouldn't be, but just as with anything in Salesforce, just because there shouldn't be there doesn't mean somebody will find a way to do something that maybe it shouldn't do. So one of the validations I often do whenever I'm doing lookup, especially like a grandchild record like this, and I've added these to a large collection, is and I'm looping through them. What I'm doing is for each one, checking to see if it's a duplicate record, because one of the things you can't do in a collection of records is update the same record twice. And all this is from real life experience of trying to build a flow that will do that and then running into flow errors, right? So learned that the workaround is, hey, if I got a collection of records that's now going through all those records and somehow the same record is getting pulled in more than once, I got to dedupe that list before I try to do the update. And so we could do that, in the front end, and maybe I could do it at the back end. There's a couple of times it makes sense. One of the features that's handy for that is collection sort. So if you add everything to a collection, you can always sort the collection, like by record ID, for example, and then go check to see make sure every record ID is unique. And you can do that by doing this. Just do a quick check. So you'll see that the decision I'm doing is just to see, I put just a text variable that is looking to see if this text variable, whatever I put in there, is equal to the current ID of the record it's showing up in my loop. And if I get to if I see the same record, then I'm just going to skip that one and say, no, I've already touched that record. I don't need to do that one again. I'm going to skip that one. And then at this time at rule level, I do whatever I'm going to do to maybe to a collection here, or I'm updating the loop record actually here. And then I'm also updating my variable, the text variable, with the current value. So that way I have that stored. So I've used this scenario many times with the check for duplicate. Of course, it's very important that your record is sorted. So you'll also see that, I don't have it sorted. I really should have this sorted by record ID. So I can come in here and make sure that in case that somehow this, when I pull all my capacity records in this query, that if I somehow end up getting duplicates, that I can identify that there's somehow duplicates are getting pulled in here because it's through a relationship, through another record that may have duplicates in it, then that could be a problem for my updates down the line. So again, not always the best practice. I am breaking the rules here a little bit and doing these couple different loops inside of a loop. Not always the best practice, but if you have low volume of records, that the relationships are always very limited on the child parent, grandchild relationships, then this may work, but it definitely requires testing. So the test method here is, let me just go ahead and save this. So I'm not going to activate it because I'm not trusting it yet, and it's only sandbox, but it's still going to so you can always once you've saved, you can debug. So that's one nice thing. So you can run. You'll see, I have this one on delay. That's the other thing I was going to show you here. So this one is, you'll see that I've got the asynchronous run, and then I also have so the run asynchronous is here's available. It just runs after all changes are committed. And this delay works in a similar way, where I'm just doing a 0 hours after the opportunity is updated. So opportunity gets updated, it's going to go on a very short delay. In this case, 0 hours, which means as soon as the save is committed, it's going to run. So this was what I was doing before this run asynchronously became an option, but this is now an option. So I probably won't have to do many of these delays anymore like this. I'll just use it run asynchronously instead. Again, just saves you from running into issues where the save may fail or you'll hit limits trying to do too many actions at the moment you're trying to also save the record, which is usually why saves will fail. They'll say, oh, you're hitting some kind of DML limit and or SOQL query limit, something like that, and it will stop you from, you'll get those nasty flow error emails. So let's go. So that's why I'm running this on a delay, because I want, when the opportunity gets updated, I don't want the opportunity update to fail. I want to make sure that this can at least has a chance to run. And if I go to debug, what's really nice about this is I can choose an opportunity in here in my org. You can look it up by name and pick one that you have staged ready. And usually what happens is it'll pop up, and then you'll see that all these run in flow and rollback mode. So if I run this and no matter what it does, it tries to make updates that are valid or not valid, it's all going to roll back anyway. So the good news is that you can't break anything by testing, even in your sandbox or even in production. If you wanted to test something live in production, just to see what's going on and with live records, live data that maybe record specific causing the problem, you can do this without breaking your production org typically. So but the bad news is you can't turn off rollback mode. So so if you wanted to make an update to records, now in a standard flow, non-record triggered flow, you can this is an option to turn rollback mode on, which I highly recommend you do. But sometimes you want to run your flow to actually cause the downstream action. This is another good argument for why you might want to consider subflows to do the bulk of the work and let your record triggered flow call a subflow. That way, if you needed to actually run your downstream action manually, let's say record didn't update for some reason, something happened, you fixed the validation rule and you want to go ahead and just run that job manually now, you could open the flow, run the job on that record if it was not record triggered flow. But with record triggered flows, they'll only run if they meet the criteria of whatever that record triggered flow is looking for. So of course, I could always just go into the record, make sure I cause the action to happen to make this thing run, and then come back here and check it or look for an email alert. But again, downstream subflows may help you a lot there. But I'll go ahead and click run just so I can show you what this looks like. If you haven't seen flow, this course is running out of delay, so this may be a really bad example. I should probably show you a debug on a different example. Let's do that on like this one. And let's do let's pick anyone. That looks good. And run. So what's really great is, that's before delete. That's not a bad example. Goodness gracious, they're not showing me much. Let's run immediately this one, debug. Let's just do that one, run. So what will happen is it will show you, why is this giving me a hard time? It's not a good example. I wasn't prepared to show this. I should not have showed this. But normally what will happen when this runs, if you do successfully kick it off, maybe I didn't meet the start condition, so it never kicked off. So that tells you something at least. But you can't, and what will happen quite often in these is, oh, you know what, that's what I didn't do. You have to come down and actually, you can update your record. I was being hasty. So I chose the record, but then you actually have to make an update to the record, and it gives you basically anything that's on your page layout for that record. You can now check the box or uncheck the box, whatever may cause that downstream flow to run. If you don't have the field on the layout, you may have to temporarily add it to your layout so you can make those updates. But if you make that up, then you can actually change your record here to kick off that flow. And then it'll actually show you, it'll actually highlights the path that the flow took to make the updates, and it shows you where every action that happened in your flow. And I like that they've got this all condensed down, so you can actually just open up the portions of the log and effectively the debug log that maybe you were interested in reviewing what happened, or just look at the end and see, well, hey, if it failed, why did it fail? So this one again failed because it didn't meet the entry criteria. So nothing happened. It was not a good test. But highly recommend you debug flows in your org before you go too far down the line with them. And just recall that the record triggered flows, you can't force them to run and make an update on a record. As you see, it's giving me a really hard time here with my current test. But if you're on a standard flow, unless you uncheck rollback, it will actually commit the changes to the org. And if that's in production, it will change your production org. So just be really cautious on how you use debug on other types of flows as well. So that's my presentation. I'm open at this point for any questions that anybody might have about flow, or I can go into other topics around flow as well if anybody's interested.
Second here to check our questions and see what we've got coming in. But I know for me, the first question I have to ask you is, what approach are you taking to move all of your current automations out of, like, say, workflow rule or process builder into flow?
Well, the way we're starting right now, it's a great question. What we're starting with right now is anything new that comes through, we are building it in using record triggered flows. So no new development is happening in process builder workflow. We've decided to cut that off as a to help future-proof our org and make that future job of actually doing the migration more tenable, right? Because the more we build in those from this point forward, it's kind of self-inflicted wounds. So we're trying to avoid those where we can down in to our future selves. But my understanding is, is there may be, again, this is safe harbor, as I used to say, because I don't have direct knowledge of what Salesforce is actually up to. I don't work for Salesforce, but my understanding is they are going to have some migration tools. So I'm kind of holding out for those because I don't want to do a lot of rebuilds unless I find it kind of necessary. For example, if there's something that's partially it's a big update that I'm making, and I have some workflow rules or some process builders that are touching those same things right now, I might deprecate some things because I'm doing some new development that's touching on those same areas. So, for example, I'm doing some updates to capacity and revenue, and oh yeah, and I've already got these other processes running on that are updating similar fields or looking at have similar decision criteria. Geez, I don't want to have these things happening in 2 or 3 different places. The great thing that's going to be with the future state of Flow is everything will be, or future state of Salesforce automation, for that matter, at least on the backend automation, everything will be in Flow, right? Because you won't have to worry about, geez, did I do this in workflow rules? Did I do this over here in Process Builder? And hunting hopefully will become a little bit easier. And that's where our strategy is going forward to really use this Subflow. So that's where I'm going to be directing my team, or have directed them already, is, hey, if you're going to be building out some many record triggered flows going forward, we are going to be using Subflow to build the core. Most of the things you see in these flows will be inside of a Subflow, and what will happen outside of record triggered flow will be decision elements. That way, we get the best of both worlds. We get the record triggered flow that's running based on the record being updated, and we have the downstream flow that we can run if we need to run manually. We can run it manually. We could run it through another means. We could actually use that same flow, maybe behind a button somewhere. If we want to give people a chance to run that automation manually for some reason, we could put a button that calls that flow and forces that action to run through via flow, perhaps. So we have so that's where my head is at as far as where we're going to go. But I'm really holding out for the migration tools before I do the bulk of the migration.
Gotcha. Okay, so Connie has been chiming in here a couple things. This was very interesting. And then she followed up with, is there a specific place to find all of the automations that might be a priority for upgrading to Flow?
Great. So the only 2 that I really know of are going to be workflow rules and process builder. So I'll go ahead and hop out of this one. Then the places you'll look is in setup. If you're not super familiar with the setup in Salesforce, workflow rules are going to be right here. These are the legacy automations that have been around, at least since I've been in Salesforce, which has been about 11 years. And I built a ton of workflow rules, and you'll see that we have many, many, many in here. This is just on one object that I've got a bunch of different workflow rules. Some are inactive because we have moved away from some of these things, but there's a number that they're still in place, right? Because they're very easy, they're very handy, they're also very stable. So I've always really liked workflow rules for that reason. But but the one thing that's clunky about workflow rules and why you're going to want to move eventually, not just because it's going away, but because I think it'll make your life easier long term, is you can do multiple decisions inside Flow. Whereas with workflow rules, you could really only do one decision, and maybe you could do multiple outcomes, but it was also limited in what outcomes you could do. You know, field updates, direct field updates, email alerts. You know, we could assign some tasks. You could do outbound messages, but we never really used that ourselves in our org. So there was just a limited output that you could do. You couldn't, for example, submit a record for approval. I mean, that's something that I was kind of annoyed at. You know, 11 years ago, when I first got in, I'm like, oh yeah, we want to use approval processes. Can I make my workflow rule submit this for approval? No, you couldn't do that. That came with Process Builder. So Process Builder is a lot more robust. So I guess what I'm getting at before I go to Process Builder, with workflow rules, you have to kind of have a rule for every single decision. Whereas with Flow, of Record-Triggered Flow, you could have one Record-Triggered Flow that does multiple decisions with multiple outcomes based on the output of those decisions. So very much like Process Builder, right? The Record-Triggered Flows will be a lot like what Process Builder is now. And really, Process Builder, what I do know about it is Flow behind the scenes. There were ways to, like, with some URL hacks that I found in the past, that you could like, for example, before we had good error handling and messaging, I would at least get a notice that this, when you get a Process Builder failure, you get a Flow error message, just like any other Flow error. So that was telling, right, that Process Builder yields the same kind of error messaging. And so you could grab the ID from the error message of the Process Builder or Flow that failed, and I could go into a Flow, open up a Flow, kind of like one of these screens, and you'll see the Flow ID is right here. I could paste the ID into this from my error message, and when I did, if it was a Process Builder, it would actually show me what looked a lot like a Flow. And I guess it was really just Record-Triggered Flows behind the scenes. But for whatever reason, they built the Process Builder UI first. And now we have Process Builder, which you'll see we have dozens of processes in here. And so just to explain myself a little bit, normally I would recommend multiple Process Builders on a single object. However, when Process Builder was first released, we were very excited about it. I've always tried to be on the front end of whatever Salesforce was coming out with, and you couldn't do every Process Builder instance was mutually exclusive. So if you had multiple decisions elements, you couldn't, and it could be that multiple things could happen and need to be updated in the same excuse me, in the same transaction, and you couldn't do that initially. You couldn't check the next decision element after the first one was met. They were mutually exclusive. So hence we ended up creating multiple unique Process Builders per object. But now as we move to into Record-Triggered Flows, my goal, once we're moving these out, I'll probably end up, besides migrating, some of these I'll migrate direct, but others I might want to, it's a good time to consider redesign. Hey, let's look at all the decisions that are in these things, and let's go ahead and maybe build fewer Record-Triggered Flows that might be able to handle many of these that maybe were built for legacy reasons years and years ago.
Definitely. Okay, so Connie followed up, and the other thing I have seen, just as an aside, is Optimizer will also show you what you have out there and start suggesting that you migrate those over to Flow. She followed up with Optimizer. Would Optimizer help determine which automations would be a priority? I don't know that it'd be able to do that. I don't think Salesforce has a way to necessarily analyze your org and figure out these processes are central to your business processes. So I think that's going to be more of a business decision.
Absolutely, yeah. At some point, yeah, your Salesforce admin human brain's got to determine what are your priorities. And the good news is because everything's not going away tomorrow. I want to stress that Salesforce has not made any end of life announcements at all on any of these things. So there's no urgency to do all these changes like before January 1st or anything like that. So and even probably not January 1st, 2023. You'll probably still have plenty of time at that point. We'll usually get plenty of notice. My experience, we usually get plenty of notice when something's going to come end of life, and usually there's delays and extensions on those things But definitely when they do announce end of life, then there'll be some urgency. But until then, I would definitely just at minimum, right, move your critical things over. So and you can start now, and it gives you less work in the future. But it's really up to you how you want to manage the move for sure.
And it is also a
Absolutely.
great time to look at your all automations, which is not needed. You may want to clean up some of the automations, because sometimes we write an automations and later we never go back and look at whether this is still needed or not. So
Yeah, absolutely. That's that. And that, I don't know if Optimizer tells us like what hasn't been run in a long time. That would be pretty helpful, at least, or what's not actually doing anything or not getting it or not updating any records. I know I definitely have tackled that. That's one of our top priorities here for 2022 is to really analyze our org in more detail, pull out fields and processes that have been, left in the dust, right? Business has changed a lot. Our org is very old. It goes back to October 2005. It's one of the old. It's actually the oldest org in NBC Universal. So it's been around a long time, and it's seen a lot of change. I've owned it for about half the time. I'm sorry, not if I said 95, that's 2005. Sorry. So it's been around since 2005, and so I've owned it for about half that time. So at least half the stuff in here is my problem. But there's a fair amount that came before me. I'm sure a lot more than half is my problem, because I've done a lot of automations. Actually, every single flow and process builder is my problem, because when I started, there was no flow and process builder. So flow was brand new and hadn't been utilized by my predecessors. So it definitely can get out of hand. You can definitely end up with a lot of automations, which is another good reason to try to limit the number of unique flows or for at least record triggered flows. I highly recommend creating, compartmentalizing your code in flows that make sense. That way, if you do have to deprecate something, it's easy to pull it out too without having to do a lot of surgery in your record triggered flow.
Definitely. All right. So Peyton has asked, how can we compare performance of quote all-in-one and quote core record triggered flows versus a core flow with many subflows? So I think the question is there a performance difference between pushing it out to subflows or having it all in that main flow?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer at this point. Just I don't have enough experience to probably speak completely intelligently on it. However, my experience just with the flows to date, I have found that having subflows, I don't see any performance issues myself. Like as far as having subflows handling some of the transaction. So I use subflows in my other flows, not my non-record triggered flows as it is, because there are some situations where I've got to do multiple different checks for different reasons and run a very similar downstream, process that I could just pass similar variables into in the subflow. And so I've been using subflows for a long time, and I find that they're just a super handy way for compartmentalizing code. Again, the main things that are going to cause you performance issues are these red elements you see here. So those are the ones you really have to worry about. I find that all these orange elements, very low impact. So using assignments, adding things to collections. I think I closed that one that had all the collections. But whenever you do loops, quite often I will this case I'm updating a single payment. I guess, yeah. Get revenue on payment. Let's see how I'm doing this one. But yeah, I'm just updating a single record. It looks like payment record ID record. Yeah. So, but I highly recommend. I'm not doing a loop. I'm doing a loop on here, but I'm just checking for something. I'm not actually. Looks like I'm just when I find what I'm looking for, then I'm updating the payment here inside the loop, which is not always the best practice either. So I highly recommend doing those outside the loop. I should have done that after. No, that's just after at least. So if a loop. Oh, that's right. I'm just doing the sum here. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. I thought this was my loop. This is my loop here. So I'm just summing things up and then adding things to a record. So it's very basic. But sometimes when I'm going through multiple records in a loop, so then sometimes if I'm updating those down to those child records, that were each of the, let's say if I was updating each of these records, I highly recommend adding them to a collection. You can do that all with assignment rules. and then at the end do your updates. That's where you're going to save yourself some trouble. And then there was a new feature, and I couldn't find it. And Michelle, I don't know if you, I know we talked about it earlier this week, but there's a feature I ran across. Maybe it's not in record triggered flows right now. Maybe it's in the other standard flows. But there's a way to control the volume of records that are updated now. And I ran into it once, and maybe I was dreaming that. But there's one of the challenges is Salesforce by default batches 200 records in every transaction, right, by default. And one of the things that you could never do in Flow previously that I think is available now, and I can't prove it because I'm not sure where to find it right now, but one of the things that I believe is available, at least, or is coming soon, is the ability to change the batch size on your updates. So instead of having 200 try to go through every time, you could reduce the batch size in some situations in Flow. And what's really great about that is then you can avoid hitting those limits, because sometimes you're trying to do 200 records, but that could cause, if there's 200 updates, maybe or you're querying something on 200 records. It can hit some or more than 200 records. It can actually, depending on what you have inside your flow, can cause those downstream failures. So I find that if you can change, that's something you could always do in Apex. You could always change your batch size in Apex dynamically, just changing inside the code. Now it looks like we may have that feature coming, which will also help with performance. Now it may make your flow run longer, depending on how many records it's trying to process. But you won't be limited to those 200 and have flow failure, which to me is the ultimate challenge with running these. Is if you run into flow failures, it's no good. That's a bad user experience when your user sees this nasty unhandled fault error of some kind.
It is available for the schedule path. So if you go to the schedule path, you will.
Let's see. Let's go back to.
And click on the advanced option. There you go.
There it is. Yeah, thank you. I knew I saw this once. And I just forgot where it was because I haven't really used it yet. So default, right? So there it says, it gives you the whole thing under this information. I know it's mice type probably on your screen, but default is 200. You can go down to 1 record at a time. And again, it'll just take longer to run if you're doing 1 record at a time, but it will help you avoid governor limits, which is a big deal, right? That's something that caused me more pain than I care to admit, as far as hitting, keep creating, pretty cool complex flows that do really great things. And then, man, somebody tried to run it on a large batch of records and we hit these governor limits. Or I try to do a mass insert or update of records and I hit these governor limits. And I'm like, what's going on? Oh man. So be able to change this is something that's huge. So yeah, I'm glad. Thank you so much, Rakesh.
Excellent. Okay, so Steve asked, what does optimize for actions and related records mean in start box of a record triggered flow? What other choices are there for the optimize for? So if you want to jump back in.
Okay, yeah. So optimize for. So this is where I said this is your before and after. So before, and I'll click on it just so I can show you the difference here if it let me. It may not because probably. No, there it goes. It's let me. So this updates the fields on the record. The trigger flows to run, and it's a high performance that runs before the record is saved. So this is really something that you've always had in Apex, right? Where you could do before triggers or after triggers. And a before trigger says before they put it into and it's all how Salesforce is managing the database on the back end. But when you're doing these, when you do fast field updates, that is going to improve the performance of your flow. It's going to run a lot faster. But it does limit what you can do. It means that, and if I click done here, you'll see that if it lets me, you'll see my options just dramatically changed. Now I've only got update records and get records. That's it. There's fewer choices. I can't do deletes. You can't update other records. You can only update the record that, I believe you can only update the record that caused the flow to run. So let me see if this give me an error. If I save this, there we go. Yeah, so it's going to tell me I've got a problem, right? Because it's oh no, it just doesn't like that I'm looking this up here. This get T-sheet vendor down here. That's the thing. It doesn't like that. But that's actually not a problem. I don't. Should be a problem. But it's supposed. So this is supposed to run faster. So that's something that Salesforce is helping us out now by running before trigger. It should be a a quicker update to the database because it's happening before it's before it's trying to do other things with the database updates. So we're, instead of trying to stage the database update and then running all these other downstream checks and updates, it's doing it before that. So it's just, again, it's more back-end database technology that I am only marginally familiar with. So I just know it's supposed to be better if you can get away with it.
Yeah, essentially Salesforce has like a 20-step order of execution on what happens
Right.
when you click save on a record. And so this is basically deciding where in that order of execution this stuff happens. And so if you think about this in terms of taking a file to a physical filing cabinet, is it that while someone is walking to the filing cabinet with this file, you stop them and go, wait, hold on a minute, I need to make a change to this. And they stand there while you make the updates and then continue on to the filing cabinet? Or do you let them put it away before you go over to the filing cabinet behind them, take it back out and do something else with it?
Yeah, if you want to learn more about that, I recommend studying for your developer exam, the Salesforce developer certification. I started getting into that a little bit, and it's pretty heavy stuff, but it's really cool just to understand more about that order of execution. There's a lot to it.
Yes, and it's complicated. All right, next question from Murphy. It says, "Hi, nice job on the presentation. What considerations do you need to make on the record triggered flow to, number one, prevent recursion of the flow, or number two, purposely cause recursion of the flow with perhaps a different decision path run the second time?"
Ooh, that's a really, really good question. That I've not run into too much because I don't often force recursion on flow. I know Process Builder has the option to run it for every update. I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to go look that up because I would assume that this is going to run once. I mentioned that earlier about the if you try to make updates mid-flow, that can be bad because it actually may cause the flow to run again mid-flow. And then if you have other updates at the end of the flow because you're trying to do two updates in the same transaction at different times with other when you're we talked about this 20-step order of operations. It's already in the middle of trying to run the update at one point in your flow, so it's already halfway through this transaction, this first transaction, and then you create a secondary transaction. That could be very bad. So I'm not sure. I know that typically with flow, you want everything to happen at the all the updates at the end. That way, now those updates, can they cause other downstream flows to kick off because now you've made an update to a record? Yes, that could actually, I believe that if you update, by updating this count, if that update then might cause this, if it met the criteria for that update, it may say, oh, I need to run this again and check. So I would have to do some testing to see if that would actually work the way I'm thinking it should. But if as long as your input criteria are clean, that can help avoid it running when it shouldn't, for running a second time. If you change this to, because you can do that, you can change this condition to none. So it's every time a record update happens, it's going to run this flow, and that could be problematic, right? If it's now I'm making an update to an account now this flow is going to run a second time. That could cause some recursion issues potentially, right? And I don't know where Salesforce draws a line as far as how many times it'll try to call the same flow in the same transaction. I'd have to look into that.
Yep. So I can definitely tell you that one of Salesforce's recommendations has been to kind of not use the same pattern for flow that we have for Process Builder, which was one process per object, and instead
really?
use your entry criteria to control when each flow should actually fire. So you may have 30 account flows, but they all trigger on different criteria, so they only run when they're needed. Now, I can also tell you from personal experience that I definitely caught myself into some recursion with that. So, be very careful, test a lot. And I think a lot of it is if you can plot out what those changes are and what all of your automations, like triggers, are going to be, I think you can probably either, number one, build to prevent, or number two, build with the intent. And I think if you're building with the intent, maybe what you would do is try and subflow it out.
Yeah, I think if as long as you group them, I think in a smart way. Yeah, and maybe it is a good idea to only run in a single record triggered flow things that are, if you want to try to group things, is make sure they are mutually exclusive. That way you're just doing maybe one decision element and then going out and doing. And I've already done that a little bit in some of my record triggered flows. Is just say, yeah, it could be any of these reasons could cause this to run, and then a decision element right outside the start element here would determine which path I want to go down.
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking before that came out, and that was part of the winter 22 release readiness, is when they made that announcement. But I was actually planning on one flow per trigger context, kind of like process. You run one process on object, so I'd run one process on account before save, one on, or before create, one after create, one before edit, one after edit.
Sure.
Apparently that's not their recommendation, but I think that's a valid option if you're worried about recursion. And I think really it's just there's a lot of architecture that has to go in here to make sure that you're only running one flow for when it should specifically run, and then making sure that if you're going to make those changes in there, do you know if there's another flow that's going to run based on the changes you're making in one flow being in the trigger criteria for your next flow.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially if you have a lot of flows, it can be challenging to manage, which is why I always appreciated the one trigger. When you got to Apex, one trigger per object. That's the mindset I had. But thank you very much, Michelle, for explaining that's not the recommendation. So I don't feel bad about having multiple single object record triggered flows now, but you still have to be careful, I guess, right, to avoid that recursion issue, depending on what updates are happening and what your entry criteria for each one.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so Peyton has another question for us. Is it suggested to use an assignment element in place of an update records element? Assignment elements appear to function the same and can handle DML.
So I always recommend assignment elements. I recommend putting your updates all at the end. Now, as long as your updates at the end, I don't mind doing like what I'm doing here, because you see I did it, where I'm actually updating the record that triggered the flow, and I'm just setting a couple values based on decision that the path that I took. So, but I do make some other updates here. So so for example, I have a variable that I'm setting here based on this decision. But I've typically, and this flow is probably a bad example of that, but in most of my flows, I will use because usually there may be multiple points of decision where each record goes through, and I could make different updates to the record based on those. I always recommend putting this update records at the end. Now, the update record has to happen one way or the other. If I was going to use assignment to set the collection or the single record variable, then you just change this to use the IDs. You just change it to the second dot here and plug in your the variable name for either the record or a collection variable that you're going to be updating or creating.
Yeah, well, and I want to clarify something from Peyton. Are you talking about any flow, or specifically before save or the optimized for fast field updates? Because assignments do not handle the DML.
Right.
However, in a before save flow, you can actually just use an assignment without the update records, or Salesforce did update it to be consistent to help with new people learning flow, that you can put an update records in a before save flow.
You can put now, Salesforce has.
I think we might have lost Rakesh.
I say you can put the update statement now in the before save flow.
Yep.
Okay.
But make sure that you're not updating same record again and again in the flow. Use the assignment element, hold everything in a variable or record, whatever, and then make one DML statement per object and entire transaction.
Absolutely. Yep.
In any case, if you want to write some of the Apex, use it, but never ever make multiple updates of the same record.
Yep. That's all. You have one update or create element per object at the end of the flow. You know, I sometimes do, and I always recommend the decisions, especially if you're doing. I sometimes will run through multiple objects, maybe create some multiple child objects, but only in a certain criteria are met and in my flow. And so I will. I may create these child records, I may not in each object. And when I get to the end, I have to do decision elements to say, is there anything in this collection to be created? So always do, that's again, just like I had on the right after the lookup to see, did I find anything that I need to update or that I can reference here? I also do that on the before I create or update records. I'll say, is there any, I'll just do a quick decision element to check to make sure that collection has records in it. Otherwise, you will have a flow failure if you try to update an empty collection.
Excellent. All right, so Steve came up with another question for us. This is a really interesting one. If a transaction modifies 5 account objects, does an account record triggered flow fire 5 separate times, or does the flow ever have to work with an array of modified rows?
Goodness gracious. So I'm not exactly, I know that Salesforce will run the flow for, I believe it will run the flow for each record, but it runs it in a batch. So how it actually processes them on the back end, I'm not 100% clear, but I do know that, so it'll run, you know, up to 200 record batch by default, unless you know, on the conditions you tell it to, as we discovered earlier, change the batch size. It's going to try to push 200 records through your flow in one batch. So it's going to treat that like a collection, and it'll split them up and run. Each one will have to run independently as its own record. But it does that. It does that for you on the back end. You don't have to worry about whether you're running one record through the flow or if you're doing an update of 5 records in a single transaction. Salesforce takes care of batching them through the flow.
Yes, but there is a caveat here. So if there's a difference between here, the Apex Trigger and Salesforce flows, because if you pass 5 records, Salesforce has 5 flows interviews. Now, if you want to look around those flows interviews, it is not possible, because Salesforce is running behind the scene a batch to process it. But as soon as you update 5 records, Salesforce will start, right? Like, for example, if you're passing 200 records in the Apex Trigger, it is a single execution, and you have all the hold of 200 records in your list, and you can write all the logics. Like, you can say, okay, if out of 200, if there are 50 duplicate, you can write the logic and say, okay, I don't want to process 50, I only want to process 150. But that's where Salesforce flows has some caveat. So I say the decision guide. If anyone wants to check, Salesforce has the architect decision guide. Check it out.
Yep. Okay, so Murphy is asking me to clarify. Hey, Michelle, did you say the recommendation to have multiple after save record triggered flows was in the Winter 22 release notes? No, not in the release notes. It was on Release Readiness Live. And I think Diana Jaffe, who was one of the product managers on Flow, doubled down and tweeted that as well. So not in the release notes, but in the Release Readiness Live recording. So I remember listening to her say that, and I went, wait, what?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I did not hear that one.
Yeah, no, it caused quite a flutter on Twitter. And so, but yeah, essentially it's kind of like a microservices philosophy of only run it when you need it instead of having it run every time and then decide if you really need it, which is definitely different from Apex.
Well, you can see ultimately by process builder, I've already been using that methodology. So it's all right.
So, yeah, honestly, this is new enough. I think there's a lot of us that are still waiting for some guidance and some clarification from Salesforce on this and trying to figure out how do you deal with all of those challenges. And to Rakesh's point, the architect decision guide that's out there for record triggered automation will help you sort of step through your considerations and figure out what you should be using.
And I'm really interested to see how Flow Orchestrator is going to work with this. I have not got into that too much yet. I know it's in pilot now. I'm not sure when that's going to be released.
Probably when they figure out how to price it.
Yeah. But I'll be curious if that'll make any of this any easier. It's just something to just keep your eyes out for or look into for anybody on the call that wants to learn more about Flow Orchestrator. It's a neat new tool coming.
Yep. All right, I think we may have actually gotten through all of the questions. I'll do one last run through here. Oh, Connie did say hello, Rakesh, once you spoke up. So always thrilled to have us on the call. So thanks, Connie. Okay, I think we have successfully gotten all the questions answered.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate your time and listening to me and taking a look at how at the new record triggered flows. I think they're going to be a pretty neat tool to keep us moving forward.
Yep, absolutely. We appreciate you coming to present on a Friday afternoon, and we hope everybody has a wonderful and fantastic weekend.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a great weekend.
All right. See y'all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.